Hi, today I'm reading from Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 3, verses 1 to 9. But the souls of the righteous are in the hand of God, and no torment will ever touch them. In the eyes of the foolish, they seem to have died, and their departure was thought to be an affliction, and their going from us to be their destruction, but they are at peace. For though in the sight of men they were punished, their hope is full of immortality. Having been disciplined a little, they will receive great good because God tested them and found them worthy of himself. Like gold in the furnace, he tried them, and like a sacrificial burnt offering, he accepted them. In the time of their visitation, they will shine forth and will run like sparks through the stubble. They will govern nations and rule other peoples, and the Lord will reign over them forever. Those who trust in him will understand truth, and the faithful will abide with him in love, because grace and mercy are upon his elect, and he watches over his holy ones.
So our second reading comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27. I bet you didn't know there was a zombie story in the second reading, in the 27th chapter of Matthew. From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "This man is calling for Elijah." At once one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink. But the other said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split. The tombs were opened and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now the centurion and those with him who were keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place. They were terrified and said, "Truly, this man was God's Son." Well, my apologies to those in the lectionary group because I'm going to tell a story I told you. Some of you will remember Billy Wilder's movie, The Greatest Story Ever Told. And near the end of the movie, which is about Christ's life, this scene is acted out, and the centurion is played by, what's his name? John Wayne. And John Wayne had one line, which was, "This truly was the Son of God." And they took the first couple of takes, and it just wasn't quite landing. And so Billy Wilder came up to John Wayne and said to him, "John, could you just put a little bit more awe in your one line?" And so John Wayne did the third take and said, "Oh, this truly was the Son of God." That probably qualifies as a dad joke, but it's a story told by Martin Sheen, who was in that movie. Here's another story. I have a friend and mentor with whom I speak frequently. He never calls me. I call him, he doesn't call me. That's how our relationship works. So, you imagine my surprise one day last January when he called me. I immediately cried into the phone, "What's wrong?" He didn't even stop to explain that nothing was wrong. He just said, "You have to get the current issue of the Walrus." He then went on to explain that the issue included an article entitled, "Why Do We See Dead People?" See, my friend and I over the years had many times discussed the Christian doctrine of the communion of saints, the idea that those who've gone on before us are present to us. He largely was a skeptic in relation to this. I migrated between being agnostic and hopeful. So I was surprised that he was taken so much by this article, which opens with this story related by Patricia Pearson, the author. In the late spring of 2015, my brother-in-law paid a visit to my sister's grave. In a lush meadow cemetery amid the Gatineau Hills of southern Quebec. My sister had been dead at this point for 7 years, and the couple had been separated for 12. Doug sat in the grass among planted geraniums for half an hour or so, musing about the rise and fall of their marriage. He told Catherine, or her grave, that he was sorry for the part he had played in the dissolution. Then plucking up and tossing a handful of grass desultory, he began his 2.5-hour motorcycle journey back to Montreal. Here's a quote from Doug. It wasn't until I was maybe halfway home that I felt her presence. I had the distinct sensation of her arms around me and her leaning in close against my back as I rode the motorcycle. It was tactile and fantastic. I felt warm. I was completely calm and happy, smiling from ear to ear. That hardly ever happens to me. His nervousness about the rain he was riding through ebbed, and it occurred to him that Catherine was there to keep him safe on behalf of their 2 sons. She, her presence, her spirit, rode behind him for 20 minutes or so. Doug again. What I know is that it did not feel at all like a product of my imagination. It felt external to me. It felt real. The article goes on to explain that there's a significant amount of research saying that a significant percentage of the population has had an experience like this. Often grieving people are comforted by these experiences, but there's a double edge to them. Because when they tell their doctors or their therapists or their clergy about them, they're often met with silence or skepticism or even a judging response that says this is a sign that your mental health is slipping. And the prevalence of these experiences is a problem for scientists too. I'm going to quote from the article again. That the dead do not always stay dead continues to rankle the scientifically minded. When Christopher Kerr, a Toronto-raised palliative care physician who heads hospice and palliative care Buffalo, first worked with patients on rounds, he was completely unprepared for the number of dreams and visions his patients described that featured the consoling dead. The acceleration of the science of medicine has obscured its art, and medicine, always less comfortable with the subjective, has been more concerned with disproving the unseen than revering its meaning, says Kerr. And that's the heart of the quandary. Nearly 150 years after the first studies of these phenomena, scientists still have no proven thesis on what exactly is happening when someone hallucinates or senses the dead. Well, if these experiences are problematic, then there are some verses at the end of Matthew's Gospel that will be downright disturbing. Matthew describes the moment of Jesus' crucifixion. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. Well, to the contemporary ear, this sounds a lot like a zombie story, doesn't it? Dead people breaking out of their graves and walking around. What the heck are we supposed to do with a story like this, besides writing it off as a ghost story passed on from an ancient and superstitious age? Well, the first thing, I just want to pause for a second and say to my two-person audience, you're watching your screen to see if it's working. I want to watch your faces a little. Okay. The first thing we can do with this story is remind ourselves it does not have to be taken literally. We don't have to believe that a small army of the living dead tromped around Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. Much of the writing in both Testaments is meant to be taken as allegory, like the story of the dry bones we read from Ezekiel last week. And if we don't take it literally, we can begin to see the powerful assertions emerging in the story. Most clear are the assertions that neither Jesus' death nor his resurrection were events that happened to one individual. Right? Let's take a look at a couple of images because the resurrection art of the Eastern Orthodox Church is really important. So guys, can we do the PowerPoint images just for a sec? What do you notice here? Jesus is rising from the grave and he's not alone. He's with a group of people. Can anybody guess who those two people emerging from their tombs are? Adam and Eve. Let's look at another image. Next one. It's the icons of the Eastern Church are full of this. The resurrection involves not only Jesus, not only his followers who are present to it, but all the generations all the way back to Adam and Eve, and all of the generations forward. Okay, we're good with PowerPoint, guys. Thank you. So what's going on here? What's going on is that all of humanity is being transformed. Not only going forward, but backwards too. There's healing, there's empowerment, there's a revitalization, not only for Jesus' followers or the people alive in his time, not only for us today, but all the way back to the first generations. For the Eastern Church, resurrection is not an individual event. In the West, our art and our theology too often describes it as such. It is profoundly communal, as in communion of the saints. I'm told that the Dalai Lama has taught that when a person finds enlightenment, her family is healed backwards for multiple generations. But how can this be? Well, I want to turn to a 20th century writer. Many of you will know him, John Steinbeck, in his great novel, The Grapes of Wrath. It's about migrant workers who are driven off their land in Oklahoma by drought. And as they migrate to work in California, they become preyed upon by unscrupulous business people, farm owners, and the authorities. And the book has two Christ-like figures. A preacher named Jim Casey. Catch the initials. JC. Who was killed, martyred. and a worker named Tom Joad who has this conversation with his mother when his own life is in danger. Ma Joad, how am I going to know about you, Tommy? Why, they could kill you and I'd never know. They could hurt you. How am I going to know? Tom Joad, well, maybe it's like Casey says. A fellow ain't got a soul of his own. Just a little piece of a big soul. The one big soul that belongs to everybody. Ma Joad says, then what, Tom? Tom Jones says, as Bruce Springsteen later stole for his lyrics, then it don't matter. I'll be around in the dark. I'll be everywhere. Wherever you look, wherever there's a fight so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. Wherever there's a cop beating a guy, I'll be there. I'll be in the way guys yell when they're mad. I'll be in the way kids laugh when they're hungry and they know supper is ready. And when the people are eating the stuff they raise and living in the houses they build, I'll be there too. There are resurrections in this book. Tom Joad is a follower of the preacher J.C., Jim Casey. After Casey is murdered, his wisdom dies into Tom Joad. His strength dies into Tom Joad. The courage to sacrifice dies into Tom Joad. In various monastic traditions, there is a tradition of having the disciples, the nuns or the monks, gather around the wise old monk or nun as he or she is dying, with the idea that their wisdom will die into them. And this is what happened to Jesus' followers, isn't it? Jesus' followers were a bunch of boneheads. They were often confused, usually cowardly, feuding between themselves. And they're present to his resurrection, and all of a sudden, they have his strength of character. They have his courage. They have his insight. They have his healing powers. And these knuckleheads go out and transform the whole ancient world, men and women. So what does this mean for us? I could try to explain it to you more, but I think I'm going to invite you into an exercise instead. I invite you to breathe. Ruach. I'm going to invite you to picture Anne Farquharson's face. Those of you who know her. We just lost her. The most recent saint of Bloor Street. I'm going to invite you to hear her voice. I'm going to invite you to think of a moment you shared with her. And I'm going to invite you maybe to think of an expression she used or her way of talking. And I'm going to invite you to open yourself and offer that the grace with which she lived pour itself into you. That the joy and the love she had for her family and for her world and for this church pour itself into you. And I'm going to just stand here for 30 seconds or so, and I'm going to invite you to do the same with somebody you love. Maybe it's Bob Farquharson, or maybe it's John Spears, or maybe it's Doris Dyke, or maybe it's Hank Aaron. But let's open ourselves, even moving through our sense of loss, into the place where the saints can commune with us and be poured into us. I don't know if you heard it over Zoom, but resonating with the opening story of this sermon, a motorcycle just zoomed right by the front of the church, making noise. As we move forward, friends, be comforted by the knowledge that these experiences of communion with the big soul and the saints often happen when we hurt, when they die, when we grieve, or just when we sit at the grave of somebody we never reconciled with, feeling that tension. May we commune together with all of our saints, and may they hold this community of faith as we journey forward. God bless us.